Welcome back to 3D Dialogue. I'm Jesse Hirsh. The book of Revelation, also known as the Apocalypse of John, is the last and some say most important book of the New Testament in the Bible. The book of Revelation talks about the ultimate defeat of evil and the return and reign of Jesus Christ. Joining me in studio to tell us more about what all this means is Nik Ansell, a professor of theology at the Institute for Christian Studies. Thank you very much for coming in today.
Thank you.
Now, perhaps we'll start with, I think, my own misconception of referring to it as the book of Revelations in the plural, and yet I see it's often referred to as the singular.
Yes.
Perhaps you could elaborate a little on that misconception, why it is the book of Revelation and not book of Revelations.
Yeah, well, it's understandable that people talk about it as a book of revelations because there are revelations throughout the book. But the word revelation is really an English translation of the Greek word which can also be translated as apocalypse, and it's in the singular. So there is one apocalypse.
And that's sort of why it's referred to as the Apocalypse of John.
Absolutely, that's right.
And so who was John?
Well, it's possible that John is one of the disciples, one of the 12, and I think that's the most probable reality then. Yeah.
Which would then assume that it was written about 2,000 years ago, is that correct?
Yes, I mean, almost all scholars think that this was written in the 1st century AD. Some think in the 90s, some think in the 60s, around AD 70 time, but certainly within the 1st century.
Now, in terms of getting at the actual story within the book of Revelation or the Apocalypse of John, certainly it's, of all the stories, I think, in the New Testament, it's the one that non-Christians perhaps are quite familiar with, second only to the life and story of Christ. Can you tell us a bit more about where this story comes from and really what it projects? Because it, again, of all the stories in the New Testament, is also the one that seems future tense rather than past tense.
Right. Well, the symbolism in the book of Revelation is all reworked from the Old Testament, really. So it's absolutely drenched in Old Testament imagery. And so a good interpretation requires intense familiarity with the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. I think quite central, we could take the word apocalypse. What does the word apocalypse mean? In our culture, an apocalypse is some kind of meltdown or horrendous event of sort of
the end of the world.
The end of the world. And in biblical literature and in what's called apocalyptic literature, the apocalypse is really a transition. And you could refer to it as the death throes of the old world order, but at the same time it's the birth pangs of the new creation. So it's a double-sided image. It's not just negative. The negative is itself a positive. It's painful, it's also hopeful. The image of childbirth is central to this book in chapter 12, for example, and that maybe captures some of the dynamics quite well.
And certainly, as you say, denoting a new start. I guess one of the other maybe mysteries of the book of Revelation, certainly for non-Christians, is in terms of its context, in terms of its timeline. Is it describing a story that was taking place 2,000 years ago, or is it describing something that will come in terms of a new birth and literally the return of Jesus Christ?
I think it's possible to say both and in response to that, but I would like to really root the book in the 1st century and events that would soon take place for its readers. The word soon occurs throughout the book. And
which certainly implies that 1st century rather than hundreds of years later, or even thousands.
That's right. I would situate the book in the middle of what's called the Jewish War, which is Jewish rebellion against the Roman Empire. And in that context, Christians, most of whom were Jewish, were really caught because they were oppressed by the empire. They had an ambiguous relationship with their fellow Jews. And that's probably, I think, the setting for the apocalypse.
Now, at the same time, certainly perhaps this is something you could acknowledge, but I think I myself have seen that a lot of people tend not to take the interpretation of it being related to 2,000 years ago, which again to me sounds very self-evident. But what of the people who literally interpret this as being modern day, that we are on the verge of this revelation and that the apocalypse is just around the corner? Do you think that's silly, or is that perhaps taking a little bit of freedom with the text to derive greater meaning for the modern day?
I think it's important with all texts to work with them until you're aware of the significance for the present day. So if something has its primary or initial meaning for 2,000 years ago, you don't want to leave the text in the past. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I don't read this as being rather like Nostradamus, giving us special inside information about the future. That can lead to a real elitism, as if you've got
special
insight that the rest of the world doesn't have. And that is really the temptation, I think, that goes with that kind of reading, wanting secret knowledge that makes you superior to others or safer than others or on the inside in some sense. And I would find that really opposed to the real spirit of the New Testament and the book of Revelation itself. So I think that's a temptation we should avoid.
Well, and as you say, it makes more sense to situate the book within the larger New Testament, and even, as you said, the Old Testament,
yes,
given that it directly comes out of that culture and that tradition.
That's right.
Are there then, given that in mind, are there then lessons that Christians and non-Christians can read from the book of Revelation without literally interpreting it as modern day, but recognizing that there are lessons from it?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, one place to start would be the image of the city that comes down at the end of the book, and it comes from heaven to earth. I think many Christians read the Bible in an escapist way, as if our ultimate destiny is to escape the earth and go to heaven. Here, the direction is opposite. It's literally a down-to-earth message. And this city is described as its gates are always open. So we have an open-ended end to the Bible in that sense. And there is no, as it were, ultimate exclusion because the gates remain open at the end.
Well, and perhaps that's a good thing to end on, because our lives are open, and certainly one doesn't know how they're going to end.
Right.
Thank you very much for coming in today. It's been very enlightening to learn, I think, from a sober perspective, the role of the book of Revelation. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
That was Nik Ansell, who's a professor of theology at the Institute for Christian Studies here in Toronto. We'll be right back after these short messages. You're watching 3D Dialogue.
The Rogers Television Viewer Response Line at 1-800-939-7787 or visit our website with your comments. Local Matters on Rogers Television.